Good operating
Welcome back.
skills consist of
While you
much
were
more
gone, we
than
moved out to the
practiced
job.
eye-to-hand coordination.
We're going to take a
Let's
look
take
at
a
some
look
of the
at
actual
things
operating
that
situations
pros
that
in
make your
business
skills
pose.
as an operator so valuable. Manufacturers produce diagrams like this so that the people that buy these machines can make fair comparisons. Comparisons about things like reach and dig depth and dump height and some other important specs. But if you study this diagram, you'll realize that this is not the way you want to be sitting when you dig to maximum depth. When you curl the bucket and come in on the stick and up on the boom all at the same time, you're doing everything you can to pull this machine up on its toes and down into that hole. If this bank is unstable, it stands a good chance of caving in and having the machine tip forward into the hole. The safest way to do this is with the machine back away from the edge of the excavation like this, but reality says it isn't always possible. One possible answer is to use a larger machine. Then you don't have to work right at the edge of the hole to get to the depth you need. Another, but less desirable approach is to travel in reverse with the machine each time you bring a load out of the hole. It may slow down production, but it won't slow it down as much as it would if you and the excavator fell into the hole. To some of the more experienced operators watching this, it may seem like common sense to do the things we've been talking about. After all, you've been doing this sort of thing for a long time and have made most of the mistakes that can be made, and you're still alive to talk about them. But because you've been lucky enough to survive, you now have an added responsibility to pass on some of the things you've learned to the people just getting started. Your experience can keep them from having to make the same mistakes and possibly avoid a tragedy in the process. There are several good equipment operator schools in North America that stress safe and proper operation. There are also the operators' manuals produced by the manufacturers. But to become really good and smooth requires practice, practice, practice. Practice should be done out in the open with nobody else within striking distance of the machine. Just don't practice when you're all alone. If something should go wrong, you always want somebody close by to be able to get help. As an operator, you never know what kind of conditions you'll find yourself in. The skill needed to work on this mountainside was acquired through hundreds of hours of actual machine operation. And these operators are responsible for the safety of themselves and many of the people working around them. This is not a place to begin your apprenticeship. Most manufacturers agree that sweeping sideways with the bucket, like this, creates stresses that the machine is not designed to take. If you do this often enough, it can make the end cap on the stick break off. I think that's what happened to that machine I told you about earlier, the one where the operator discovered the cracks in the end cap welds because of the strange cracks in the paint. Visibility from an excavator is pretty limited compared to some other pieces of construction equipment. In addition to the boom blind spot and a lot of sheet metal all around you, there's also the problem of being on a machine that rotates 360 degrees. You have to be aware of activity within your complete circle of operation. OSHA is now issuing citations for failure to provide swing radius barricades. The cost of not making sure everything is clear before you move the machine could be rather high. The boss should never have parked his truck there in the first place, but I'll bet he won't blame himself for this little mishap. You might want to think about getting someone else to give the boss a ride back to the office. He probably won't be much fun to be with for a couple of days. These are the kind of jobs that separate the pros from the amateurs. This bridge is being replaced over a busy expressway. It has to be taken down between 11 o'clock at night and 4 o'clock in the morning. There's no room for mistakes. The dangers of working with artificial light, the air filled with dust, and the noise of these three breakers working this close together can't be described. It can only be experienced. All of these operators share in the responsibility for each other's safety and the safety of the other people on the job. I'll bet that there isn't a single person watching this right now that doesn't recognize the safety hazard that's taking place. Every one of us has seen material come spilling out of a bucket or have the bucket accidentally hit the sideboards. If that driver gets injured, who do you think is going to be blamed? You have a responsibility to yourself as well as the truck driver to refuse to load his truck until he either gets back in the cab or completely away from the truck. And this is not what we mean by making sure the truck driver is out of harm's way. Letting anybody ride on any part of the machine while you're working is an invitation to disaster. Don't allow riders. Whenever you leave the machine, you should put the tool on the ground and shut the engine off. If you leave the tool in the air and someone accidentally drives into the bucket, or even if a line broke and it dropped to the ground, it could result in a serious injury that you would be responsible for. No one can ever predict when a mechanical failure like a ruptured hose or a broken fitting will cause an accident. If someone had been under this bucket when it dropped, a hard hat would probably be big enough to bury him in. Always rest the tool on the ground when you're not using it. Hydraulic breakers require some special safety considerations. You should always protect your eyes from flying chips. Wear safety glasses and ear protection. A dust mask will also help protect your lungs. And keep the front windows closed. A piece of window glass that has to be replaced is a small price to pay for protecting your eyes. Things like dust masks and ear protectors were designed to help you keep your lungs and ears working. Big, tough macho guys don't use them. You can tell which ones they are. They're the ones that cough a lot, and you have to shout at them so they can hear what you're saying. Just a couple of quick points when operating a hydraulic breaker. Always maintain some down pressure on the tool to keep it from cycling in the air and damaging the internal parts. And don't pry with the point or change your impact angle while it's working. New breaker points start at around $7,000 and go up rapidly from there. As we said before, you never know where the job will take you when you become an equipment operator. The skill required to handle materials in this scrap operation are just as critical as if this machine were working on a mountainside. In addition to the other very expensive equipment working in the area, there are people walking around who could be seriously injured or killed if this operator fails to pay attention to what's being done all the time. Based on experience and from talking with other guys in this business, I've come to the conclusion that one of the most dangerous parts of this job is other people on the site. You have no control over them, and you never know for sure what they're going to do. But if you injure or kill somebody while you're at the controls, even if it was their screw-up, you'll probably be considered responsible. Dropping a piece of pipe and breaking it may cost a few bucks, but if you injure or kill somebody in the process, the real cost can never be calculated. It may sound wimpy to some of you, but not letting anyone work within the swing arc of the machine is a good safety habit to get into. Back in '86, I knew a guy who was working on a new building job in the city. He was setting sewer laterals, and there were a lot of laborers on the job. He was concentrating on the trench and didn't even know that one of the laborers had crawled between the tracks to get a piece of pipe that was laying there. When the laborer backed out, he stood up, and the tail swing on the machine caught him and pushed him down against the top of the tracks. He was a big guy, and it did terrible things to his insides. It didn't kill him, but I think for a long time he wished it had. And I'll tell you this, it almost killed my friend. He says he still has nightmares about it. I've always had a healthy respect for power lines. If you've been knocked off your feet by 110 volts at home, you can be sure that 50,000 volts will turn you into a crispy critter in less time than it takes to say it. Because humidity and other conditions can affect the ability of electricity to arc or jump across a space, to something like your nice steel machine with its steel feet firmly anchored to the ground, there are safety standards established to keep you from working too close to live high-tension lines. OSHA requires a clearance of 10 feet when working around energized lines of 50,000 volts or less. For anything over 50,000 volts, the minimum is about a half inch for each 1,000 volts, and in many cases, There are requirements to have a signal person on the ground that can observe both you and the power lines at all times. If a power line is struck, the operator is generally okay if they stay in the machine. It's the poor person on the ground that gets electrocuted. That's one more responsibility the professional operator takes on, to make sure your fellow workers are not injured by something you've done. Of course, not all utility stuff is hung up in the air where you can keep an eye on it. A flagman on the ground won't do you much good when your bucket comes out of the ground trailing a bunch of telephone cable or water pipe. One that scares me as much as the high tension lines is to someday cut into a big old ugly gas line. You shouldn't even dig in the middle of the Sahara Desert without getting the one call system to come through and mark all the utility locations of everything within 100 feet of where you're going to dig. It's actually illegal and punishable with some pretty stiff fines to begin an excavation without contacting the one call system in your area. Disrupting vital emergency services is also punishable by severe fines. If personal injuries are involved, the accident could lead to criminal liability charges. You have a responsibility to know what is down there before you put the bucket in the ground. Know what the standard buried utility color codes are and how to contact the local one-call system at least 5 days before you're going to dig. Of course, every now and then you'll find yourself having to dig under some known line. That requires knowing the exact location of the line. If it's a pipe, you need to do some hand probing with a rod or shovel. If there's a chance that there is electric or telephone cable down there, make sure you use a wooden or fiberglass rod to do any hand probing. Once the line is located, you need an observer on the ground to watch what you're doing at all times. You need to have a lot of patience and plan on going real slow and easy at this point. Communication between you and the ground observer are critical, and you probably won't be able to hear each other over the engine. You need to both know and follow the standard industry hand signals. If you're working with a new kid on the block, help him out. Remember, you were the new kid once. Speaking of signals, a good idea is to make it a practice of blowing the horn twice before you back up. When you're on a big job with a lot of other machines around, nobody pays very much attention to all those backup alarms going off. But your horn has a different sound and helps people in the area know that you're about to move the machine. But even with the horn, swing around and look behind you before you attempt to back up. If we want to get right down to basics, the fact is that this machine was never designed to be a crane. But let's be realistic and admit that we all do things with an excavator the engineers who designed it never had in mind. If we use some common sense and caution, we can still get the job done without tearing up the machine or getting anybody hurt in the process. But the magic words are common sense. By the way, OSHA's taken to issuing citations for crane violations for machines being used to crane objects, whether they're an actual crane or not. Think about it. Of course, you have to start by knowing the weight of the object you intend to pick up. And as you already know, it makes a lot of difference if you're going to pick it up over the front or over the side, and how close in the object is too. The other thing you better know is the rated capacity and actual condition of an alloy steel chain or wire rope or any other kind of sling device you intend to use. I can't say it enough. The responsibility for the safe operation of anything you do with this machine is in your hands. Sitting in a courtroom and trying to explain to some jury who doesn't know a backhoe from a bulldozer that you didn't know the chain rating won't win you any points. No matter what kind of a sling you're using, you should always wear gloves to handle it, but that's especially true if you're using wire rope. The other thing to look for with wire rope, or chains, or anything else, is to make sure that there are no kinks or twists or knots in it before you start the pick. Always inspect a sling device before you start to use it. If you're working with a trench box, you need to know if the machine is big enough to move it along. There's a lot of stress on the box with all that dirt around it. These are the kind of things that real operators think about before they get into trouble. When you get into some easy digging like this, where you're simply baling dirt, it can be tempting to put a 3-yard bucket on a 2-yard machine. But that kind of cheating has cost more than one operator their job and has even caused some serious accidents. Don't ever put a bigger bucket on the machine than it's rated for. It just isn't worth the risk, and the manufacturer won't stand behind you when something breaks. Of course, you've never done anything like this. The amount of stress that's put on the stick at every single pivot point is scary. It may not break the first time you do this, but do it often enough, and it's a guarantee that you will break something, and maybe somebody, if they're around when the stick or bucket falls off and drops into the trench. In winter conditions, metal becomes more brittle, so how you treat the machine becomes even more critical. Warm weather is a little more forgiving than sub-zero temperatures. That doesn't mean you can beat the machine up in the summer and not in the winter. It just means you need to be more aware of the machine's limitations, as well as your own under varying climate conditions. Situations like this are always dangerous, in part because you can't see where the bucket is actually going, and you also can't tell what the water is doing to the bank you're sitting on. A buddy of mine runs one of these things, and I remember him talking about working on a big pond in Arkansas and having the bank cave in because the water was just eating it away while he was sitting there. He just swung around to dump up on shore when the bank started to cave. He swung back as fast as he could and caught himself with the stick, but the machine had nosed down into the pond and the water was up in the cab and over his feet. He said he didn't mind getting his shoes wet so much, but when he wet his own pants, it got to bothering him a bit. Different manufacturers have developed different control pattern setups for a lot of reasons. If you talk to somebody that's always operated Cat, they like their machine best. The same thing is true if you've always operated Deere, or Case, or Komatsu, or Kobelco, or somebody else. And that doesn't mean that the control patterns are always the same, even within the same manufacturer. Your left hand may control the stick and swing on one machine, and control the boom and swing on another. Someday, you may even wind up being asked to operate one of these old veterans. Putting one of these to work might be a trip down memory lane for you, but if you aren't comfortable with the controls on the machine you're operating, the results can mean disaster. I read a news story about 2 months ago about a laborer that was killed while working in a trench when the backhoe bucket struck him in the chest. From what I heard afterward, the operator was not experienced on that particular machine. Working around people is not the place to gain experience with a set of controls. Working on a little grade like this is usually no problem if you use an average amount of caution and common sense. Most manufacturers will recommend that you cast the spoil uphill well away from the excavation. That's to keep the machine stable by placing most of the weight on the uphill side. But a lot of operators prefer to put the spoil on the low side to keep pressure off the trench wall and to keep rocks and lumps from rolling into the trench. I won't even attempt to get into the OSHA regulations and standards about trenching. That's a separate program. Common sense, experience, talking with other operators, and thinking about what you're trying to do and the forces involved can save you a lot of grief in any operation. Steeper side hills require a lot of different approaches. You may have to bench your way across the hill by building up under the low track or cutting in for the high track, or in extreme cases, you may have to do a combination of these things. Before you start an operation like this, you want to be real sure your machine is in top condition and everything is working properly, including the track brakes. A guy I know in Colorado can tell some pretty hairy stories about steep slope work like this. For one thing, you never raise the bucket any higher than you absolutely have to. That helps maintain your balance, and it lets you get the bucket down on the ground as quick as possible to stabilize yourself. If you start to slip sideways, you should turn the tracks downhill and get the bucket on the ground quick. He also said you learn to keep the load in as close to the machine as possible to maintain a good balance and center of gravity. This is where experience and that feather feel on the controls makes an operator worth his weight in uranium. Anybody who operates a steel machine that's sitting on the ground and is probably the highest thing around during an electrical storm has got to have a secret death wish. If lightning can find some golfer holding a 5-iron out in the fairway, It won't have to work very hard to find you sitting in a machine in the middle of an open field. No way, Jose. When the sky lights up, it's time to shut down and find some safe place to wait it out. Of course, there's no way we could begin to point out every single operating hazard you'll encounter in your career. We hope that some of the things we've shown you will make you a bit more safety conscious in your day-to-day operation. Common sense will tell you that you should never swing or lift a load over a person, or even over the cab of a truck you're loading. Working around a high bank or up on top of a cliff or near the edge of any existing excavation can be extremely dangerous, not just for yourself, but for your fellow workers. And you hold a big share of responsibility for their safety. One of the more dangerous situations is when you find yourself on a job where there are a whole bunch of sidewalk superintendents. Here's some nice old guy trying to fill his days of retirement by marveling at how you do your thing. The problem is, he has no idea of just how dangerous that can be. It puts an added responsibility on your shoulders. You need to be aware that some tools can actually be curled into the cab. The last thing you need is to have a steel I-beam shear tap you on the toe. Make sure you use short slings on loads to keep the swing down as much as possible. You know how important good vision and hearing and hand-to-eye coordination are, and I'm sure you know how alcohol or drugs affect your coordination. You're an adult working in a well-paid, highly respected profession with a lot of responsibility, and that's exactly the way everybody expects you to act. Let's take a break and kick around some of the things we've just covered. If you think some of the stuff we've just told you is BS, say so, and then say why.
Becoming a respected pro is worth working for. Lots of people can drive construction equipment.
Every one of you will learn something in the process. We'll be back with the last part of this program in just a little while.
Driver. It's worth thinking about, isn't it?